Hi there. In this video, I'm going to test out 25 different vacuum tubes in the Tube Ultra Gain MIC100 by Behringer. This is similar to a microphone preamp, also made by PreSonus, and ART also makes something called the Tube MP, and it's from the older generation. The newer generations, they've got the mic 200 with an extra knob for some kind of voicing effect. I also have a Tube MP Studio, not the V3, so that would be the counterpart to this, that this thing is kind of a copy of. And it sounds actually very, very similar. I can't really tell the difference. What was I going to say? Oh, yeah, I was going to try to do these tests with the Art Tube MP Studio. However, one of the knobs was really stuck on and wouldn't pull off. So rather than break the cheap plastic knob, I went with the Behringer, where both the knobs popped off and I got at the tube really easy. There's just 4 screws you take off the sides to sort of lift up the faceplate of the Behringer. You don't lift it all the way off because there's sort of ribbon cables holding the upper plate circuitry to the bottom plate circuitry, but you open those 4 screws and you can see in and pull out the tube. There is this little rubber thing with a mount that sort of holds the upper tip of the vacuum tube so it doesn't rattle around or get loose in there, which is really a great design. And that mount is bolted to the case, so you also take that off and then you can pull out the tube, wiggle it out back and forth kind of easily. So that's what I did. Where did I get these tubes? Okay, I am not a real electric guitar player. Sophomore and junior year of high school, I did the whole play rock guitar in a band thing. I never really used a tube amp before I got my amp that I used in my band, which was a Fender Champion 110 from 1996, solid state. The distortion that wasn't good enough for my rock band, but I put a Digitech RP80 and I found some distortion that I was happy with. It wasn't like full-on metal distortion, just it's the kind of soft classic rock sound my band was trying to make. It worked just fine. So I never really was a tube guy, but I did borrow this tiny little Fender practice amp from a gentleman at my church who recently passed away, sadly, but he was nice enough to loan that to me for a few months before I bought my own gear, and it sounded pretty nice. I wasn't really appreciating how nice that tube crunch was, but I did play that real Fender tube amp. Otherwise, I've never played like a Marshall or the Fender kind of tube amp that Stevie Ray Vaughan had. I've heard it a lot, and I know that the Digitech ain't nearly as good as real tubes. But anyway, and I've been mostly a classical guitar player for the past 15 years, classical and jazz. Maybe I like a little bit of slight distortion, which transistors can provide. Like if you're playing Wes Montgomery and you hit a loud octave note, maybe you want it to just slightly break up. And even in classical guitar, when you listen to the microphones on really old records like 1928 recordings of Segovia in London, there's tons of tube distortion when he plays a loud note from the microphone preamps, which is much like what this thing is, although this is what they call a starved plate design. The tubes are only getting a very low voltage. It's powered by a cheap power supply. This one is 9-volt AC, as is the Art Studio MP. So the tube isn't maybe running up to its full potential. It still gets hot and it still distorts and it sounds, the reactivity of these things when you play them, it is fun, and you can dial in decent sounds, and that kind of reacts to your picking, though they can, if you're going for full on saturated heavy metal distortion, just trying to use this little microphone preamp is going to let you down. But there is real tube distortion going on, and it's fun to play with. Now, where did I get all these tubes? Okay. My dad is an electronics guru, but never really specialized in audio. He had a friend who was a computer engineering professor and a full-blown audiophile, had the Harman Kardon Citation 2, a bunch of Dynaco amps, Mark IIIs, a couple Pass 3 tube amps, which I'm actually playing some of the Telefunken tubes that were in this video, a Pat 4, Dynaco preamp, a bunch of juicy audiophile goodies, which I've been enjoying and thinking about selling some of it. And anyway, as part of that, there's a box full of vacuum tubes, which my dad said were all tested as good at some point. I got a tube tester for $12 from an older gentleman in my area cleaning out his basement, and I couldn't figure out how to use it. So I figured at the bare minimum, if I'm going to sell these tubes, I can test them in this MIC100. Now, just using the microphone preamp function where you speak into it, and I'm not speaking through it right now, I'm talking directly into my USB audio interface. So there is no preamping with the tubes on my speech right now. But anyways, rather these preamps with the tubes can be used sort of underneath the clipping tube warmth levels, or you can have it distort a little bit. And I decided to just play my Squire Telecaster with the stock bridge single coil pickup directly into this tube Altergain MIC100, and then record the signal out of that into my USB. So this is just this MIC100 unit with the Telecaster going into it. And I've got kind of the same settings-ish on all these things. A couple times I move them a little bit, but I'm mostly leaving about the same settings and just adjusting my volume knob to determine how much it's going to distort. And this particular guitar puts out a nice consistent signal with volume from roughly halfway to full. The only big difference in the tone when you do that is it's just the volume. It doesn't affect the tone a lot. The tone knob affects the tone, of course. When you turn it all the way to the right, you get the brightest tone. And I think most of these, I had it all the way to the right. A couple times I messed around with bringing it back a little bit. So anyway, this isn't scientific. I'm not running the exact same signal. I'm sort of feeling out the tubes and enjoying them. They are all, and I'm recording this right after I just played these 25 tubes. So all the tubes are fun. There were actually 27, but two of them, one of them was completely dead, didn't run a signal, and it was a Mullard, which is unfortunate because those are worth the most. And the other one, I forget which company, but it was flaky. It would chop in and out, but it did have this cool vintage sound when it was flaking in. So anyway, let's get into the tubes. Okay, the first tube we're going to listen to is the brand new tube. It's a little bigger diameter than the rest of them. It's actually called a 12AX7B, which I don't know what that means. All my other ones are an AX7A or just a regular AX7. So this is what came in the unit when I got it. It looks shiny, brand spanking new. By the way, I got this the MIC100 preamp used. I understand the previous owner who was deceased was a pirate radio station guy. So at any rate, I'm guessing that this is the tube that Behringer put in it, probably a couple bucks Chinese tube. And let's go ahead and take a listen. Here we go. Alrighty, that was a little bit of a 6-5-4 chord progression in E minor, except I'm tuned a whole step down, so I suppose that would be D minor, and then some eruption whole step down. Good old sophomore year of high school over a decade ago. Yeah, that's kind of nasty when you crank the gain, and I think that's what you expect from this cheap unit, but the tube is distorting. The cheap Chinese tube is distorting, and the cheap starved plate thing, you're not going to get your deep heavy metal saturated tone from this. But anyways, that's the reference point. That's the tube that came with it. Our next tube is a vintage Sylvania made in the USA, 12AT7, and I think you will clearly hear maybe at the low distortion levels it's not that much better, but the heavy distortion, this tube is going to shine a little more. Okay, yeah, you just heard me doing some quick swells on the volume knob at the end there. This was earlier in the night. I wasn't really pumping the most distortion out of that as I could have, but still, I clearly felt the night and day difference. That Sylvania was better than the cheap Chinese Bugera or this 12AX7B Bugera or something. It says premium selected. I'm pretty sure it means selected as in someone reached in a box and selected it at random. 99% sure. Anyway, our next tube is a Mullard ECC82, which that's the British name for a 12AU7, which is lower gain, but you can turn the knobs to get it all kinds of saturated. So let's hear that one. Okay, yeah, that was fun. I do clearly remember earlier in the night when I was getting started, that was my third tube, and there was some excitement there because it was reacting and sounding rich, and definitely the Sylvania was better than the Chinese, and the Mullard was better than the Sylvania for some measure of better. I'm not a hard rocker, but I could tell that the Mullard was fun. There are going to be some tubes that aren't Mullard, or some tubes coming up that aren't some classic brand that you expect to sound good, that I actually had a lot of fun with and sounded good to me, even with this $20 used microphone preamp. It's pretty pathetic if you're trying to get your heavy metal distortion with a $20 microphone preamp. But anyways, it's the only tube guitar equipment that I've got. So anyway, from now on, I'm going to play the tube first for you and then tell you what it is right after, so you can guess if you want. Okay, so here's the mystery tube. Okay, that was actually another Mullard ECC82/12AU7, just a brother tube to the one you just heard. I'm sorry, it's kind of sacrilegious to play Eruption on a single coil with a really shitty one tube distortion circuit. But anyway, that's what I was doing. Sorry. Next mystery tube, go. Yeah, that was a little smoke on the agua for you all. Classic thing to annoy people with in the music shop. Anyway, that was a GE with very faded white labeling, 12AU7. And by the way, I'm tweaking the levels a little bit after the fact so they all sound similar. 12AU7 is a little less loud of an output, but you can turn knobs on this unit to get all the same sorts of saturated sounds. They're very similar. Anyway, my opinion, I do remember the Mullards being distinctly more fun and nice than the GE, but it was respectable. You know, I could certainly see it being put into a good guitar amp and possibly doing its job quite well. Definitely better than that Chinese thing. Anyway, here's the next mystery tube. Yeah, so that was another Mullard 12AU7. I don't know why I played a little shorter there. Maybe that one was a little less inspiring than the other two. I don't exactly remember. Or maybe I was just getting tired of playing the same thing a bunch. But anyway, that was a Mullard 12AU7. Here's the next one. That was also a Mullard 12AU7. Yeah, maybe you noticed a little bit of weak wimpiness when I chunked a low note there. That was something I noticed, that certain tubes were just exciting and held up when you chunked a low note, even in this cheap circuit. And this one even being a Mullard, and I think it might just be a 12AU7 thing. You know, but I attempted to chunk a low note there with high distortion and it didn't deliver. That's just a commentary. Here's the next tube. Yeah, so that was actually another GE 12AU7, the second one of two. I did the other one earlier. Very faded white markings on it. That one, for whatever reason, I had a little more fun with than the first one. I don't know if that's placebo or was just getting warmed up to remembering how to do rock and roll stuff, but anyway, that was a fun tube. Here, let's hear the next one. That was an RCA 12AT7. Now, if you don't know, the AU7 has the least gain, and the AX7 has the most gain, and the AT7 is something kind of in between. And that may have sounded a little hotter and more crunchy, and some of that could be because I probably left the same settings on the two knobs of the device. And just the natural higher gain was distorting more, maybe. Anyway, I did, especially when I turned up the volume knob to push that distortion, I did feel some excitement with that tube. I could imagine it being combined maybe with another distortion pedal and a good amp, and actually, you know, maybe being useful to enhance distortion, enhance a real electric guitar setup, maybe for a particular sound. You know, and any of the tubes before could as well. But anyway, I remember feeling some excitement when I did that one. Yeah, so RCA with really faded orange paint. And here's the next tube. was a GE 12AT7, another 12AT7 faded label. Again, rock isn't really my genre. You know, I dabbled in high school, maybe played 12-ish live performances with a high school band, but it hasn't been my thing lately. So and these strings are actually 13 flat wounds set up for jazz. So trying to bend a bit with them is painful. Anyway, here's the next tube. That was an RCA 12AX7A with the orange RCA label for my own personal notes. A part of the R and the C were faded in certain spots. I guess I don't have to talk on the video about that because I've got my own notes to sort these tubes out with their various aged markings. Anyway, so we just moved up in gain up to a 12AX7 and A. And I was really feeling inspired by that. Even in such a cheap little unit, I was getting inspired, you know, threw in some Michael Jackson there. I could imagine put that tube in a real, you know, the preamp of a real Fender or Marshall kind of amplifier, and it would probably cut the mustard. Anyway, here's the next tube. Any of these might, you know, who knows what they'd sound like in another circuit. Anyway, here, this is the next tube. played a little longer that time because I was really enjoying playing with that tube. That was a Mullard 12AX7, super vintage, which, it may have been a placebo effect because I had heard previously, learning about this a week or so ago on YouTube, that people like Mullard. But there was something more than placebo there. I really liked that tube. So I played a little bit of... it's a song called Hoy Tengo Miedo by Phobia. Came out around the time I was in high school. It's not really a distorted song. I mean, it's got a lot of effects in it, sort of delay and stuff. And that's in E major, D major. It would have sounded like D major because I'm a whole step down. But I was playing the thirds there, not just the power chords, the major and minor thirds. And most of the distortions I remember on my digital unit would sound very muddy when you added thirds, but something with that tube was just it was more forgiving. You could, even at high levels of distortion, there was less mud, and for the medium level of distortion where I played the Hoy Tengo Miedo, you could put the major and minor third in it. I was just having fun with that tube. It's hard to describe, but it was different. I don't know how it would sound like in a Marshall or whatever, but I got a gut feeling that's a good tube. I don't know if I'll sell it. Maybe I will. Anyway, here's the next tube. That was an old Amperex 12AX7. And here's the next tube. That was a Telefunken 12AX7 German. That came out of a Dyna Pass 3 audiophile preamp that I also found and had been listening to. It sounded nice in the preamp, not really a lot of distortion in that context, but it's just this undescribable vintage tube feel that's sort of so subtle. It's not like a distorted guitar when it's in the audiophile preamp. Something else. That was a fun tube. I really liked the soft distortion on it. I don't know that I had it dialed in right on the heavy distortion. It's possible that one could use it in a heavy distortion context. But for really soft distortion in the actual context of a microphone preamp where you just want a little warmth to a vocal, that tube might be one to look into a little more. Anyway, here's the next tube. That was another Telefunken 12AX7 from the same Dynapass 3 preamp, kind of a brother tube. It played very similar. I only can distinguish it from it has a little brown speck up on the top. Anyway, a couple notes at this point. When you hear it fade in at the beginning, I'm literally chunking a chord, and I just plug in the 9-volt AC, and I'm waiting for the tube to warm up. And depending on the tube, it takes 5 to 20 seconds for the heater in the tube to warm up enough that electrons actually get emitted and the sound goes through. I am not warming these up for 10, 20, 30 minutes, as is recommended in a guitar amp. With 25 tubes, and I want to do them all in one night, I just don't have time for that. I warm them up for 20 seconds-ish, and then I play them for a minute, and then I unplug the thing and test another tube. I just don't have time to fully warm them up. I did play that Chinese tube last night, and it did just sound a little better after about 10 minutes when the case gets really hot around the tube. It did a little bit of its Chinese crappiness resolved itself when you warm it up, but for the most part, I think it was pretty similar. Anyway, we're using the non-warmed up tubes as sort of a proxy and comparing for what we'll compare them all apples to apples in their non-warmed up state. Another note is when I'm playing that eruption stuff, in all of these you'll hear me flake out every once in a while, except for one tube, which I made a note that actually was slightly flaky, but then when it warmed up I thought it wasn't flaky anymore, so I have a note to myself somewhere which tube that was, and I may not include that one. Where was I going with this? Anyway, it sounds like it flakes out. That's just when you have a single coil pickup and the guitar is just very unforgiving, and you make any error with your finger tapping and the volume will sort of cut just as a natural error in your fingers. It's not an error in the tubes. When you have more of a real Marshall kind of sound, like what I dial in my digital RP80 effects pedal, with some delay and reverb on top of that, and then echoing throughout your room with your guitar amp, and using a humbucker in your bridge position, you just get as you know, this is remembering from high school though. I pulled out and lighter strings also. You just have a much more forgiving. You know, you get that soaring 80s sound, and if you mess up your finger tapping a little, it's more forgiving. But this setup is very raw and dry, and it's kind of unforgiving. So anyway, that's just a note that, and you'll hear a lot more of that because my fingers were getting tired at this point in the night. Anyway, here's the next tube. That was a Sylvania 12AX7. Still can't quite get over the fact that Sylvania also makes light bulbs, but the tubes are actually pretty good. You know, and again, I'm not never really tested all these in a real amplifier, so don't take my word with a grain of salt. But that was a fun tube. I did slightly get the feeling that pushing it to high gain, something was just a little not as good as the Mullards. And again, who knows how it would respond in a real amplifier. Here's the next tube. That was another Sylvania 12AX7. Different color label, definitely a different batch, possibly a different decade. Both of them old and vintage. I haven't looked up what colors of labels go with what decades or whatever. But that was good. I like that one. I could tell it was a kind of related to the other one, but a little different, I guess. Because I'm responding to how this tube is breaking up on me, on the same preamp settings. And it's an entirely different feeling than just handing off these audio clips to you, because I'm more intimately aware with how I'm messing up with my fingers and what's actually happening with the tube. Anyway, both of those Sylvanias, I feel like they did the mild distortion thing really well. So like in a more grown-up guitar preamp, you've got a bunch of 12AX7s and each of them do a little bit of work, distorting the sound further and further. So perhaps in that context it's a prime tube. It wasn't as inspiring as the Mullard on the high gain, in my opinion, just with my minute of playing around with it. Here's the next tube. That was an Amperex 12AX7. I had another Amperex before. This is the one that I found within a box. But I don't think it's a new old stock because it just looks so old and used. I think someone just stored it in the box. Here's the next. Oh, and by the way, somewhere around here, I had a couple of bad tubes. And I tweaked all the preamp settings all over the place just to see if I could get the tube to work. And so there may be a little not quite apples to apples with, my 50% to 100% on my volume knob on my guitar is the main way I'm adjusting the distortion levels. But how deep of distortion I'm probing on each of these tubes could get thrown off a little bit because of settings on the preamp when I had the tubes that I threw out in there. Anyway, that was somewhere around here, so it's not quite apples to apples. That last tube definitely had shined in the low distortion setting. It definitely could do the smidge of tube warmth on vocals if you wanted it to do that. But also it was muddy as heck when you dip into that deep saturated distortion. Here's the next tube. That was another Telefunken 12AX7, which came from the guy who used to own the Dyna Pass 3 preamp. But this one wasn't in the preamp. It was in a cigar box with notes saying that these were parts for the Pass 3 preamp. And it was in a brand new box, and I think it was a brand new Telefunken 12AX7 because it looked nicer than the other Telefunkens that were already in the preamp. That particular preamp was stored in, not the nicest basement storage room with the cover off for several decades, pushed up against the insulation on the ceiling and humidity variations, so that wasn't, anyways, but this tube was off in a cigar box, safe and sound, while the decades rolled by. Now you heard it in a different context because I think the knobs got nerked on my preamp and I was dipping into way saturated distortion that no matter what tube you put in this circuit, it's gonna suck balls. Forgive me. I'm not even going to bother editing that out. Sorry. Hopefully there's no 12-year-old kids listening to this. In fact, probably everyone who's listening to this is a 12-year-old kid, because who would try to make distortion for $20 but a 12-year-old kid, or a 32-year-old guy trying to sell old tubes in his basement. Anyway, where was I going with this? Yeah, I liked those Telefunken tubes. I get the feeling that for low amounts of distortion, like they do the microphone preamp thing really well, or possibly even in a guitar context where they're in a better circuit. All right, here's the next tube. That was a Mullard 12AU7, low gain compared to the AX7. I was enjoying that. I liked that tube. I recognize that none of this, especially the heavy distortion of none of these in this circuit on heavy distortion would, you'd never use that in a live gig or a recording studio. It's just, get a Digitech pedal from the early 2000s or one of these Zooms or Line 6s or whatever, and your digital Marshall simulator is going to be better for that saturated distortion sound. But still, even in the context of this circuit, I think I am definitely not fooling myself when I notice that some of these tubes are different. At the very least, the 12AU7 is less gainy at the same knob settings on this thing. So the tube is doing something in the circuit. You can look at it. It's wired into the circuit, and it glows and gets hot. So anyway, I liked that tube. I wasn't being real precise with how much hiss is in the background on any of those tubes, but I think I had the feeling that particular one had less hiss and just a more mature, it was one of the ones with a particularly mature distortion on the low gain settings. None of them have a mature distortion on the high gain settings. Anyway, so that's a good tube. I don't know if I sell it. Maybe I will. I'll probably try to be smart and get a little extra money if I sell that one. Okay, next tube. tube, I think it might have been CBS or something like that. Couldn't. I need to do a little more research. I'm sure I'll quickly figure out what company that tube was made by. But that came out of a powered crossover. So this is a thing you'd put between your hi-fi in a real old school hi-fi setup. You'd put it between your preamp and a pair of power amps. One power amp going off to your tweeter and one power amp going off to your woofer. And it came out of the unit that sort of has a separate high-pass channel and low-pass channel to split the highs and the lows to the two power amps. It's called a Heathkit XO-1, which was built by this gentleman my dad knew from a kit in 1959. That tube may very well also be the original from 1959. It looks that old. It's got the film of basement dust just over the top of the tube, and so there were two 12AX7s in each of those crossovers. I have a pair of those XO1 crossovers that the same guy built from a kit. And they're not the same brand, but they're almost the same. And so the other one has what looks like a braille C, but like a really long in the horizontal direction C made up of these braille dots. And I'll have to research what that actually is. But all four of these tubes I would lump in the same category. They're 12AX7s, but they're way different than all my other 12AX7s. They're way older, and they have a certain... It's almost like a coarser distortion, very old school. It makes you think about imagine yourself in a 1960s truck just clunkety-clunking down a gravel road. It's got a grainy grit to it that I don't know if that's a positive or a negative, but it's just a different thing. Anyway, I'll give it away for you. The next three tubes will be the next three tubes from those 1959 crossover units, and I'll just play them rapidly back to back. So here's the next tube from the crossover. Yeah, that was the one with sort of the horizontally stretched Braille C logo. And then here's another crossover tube. Yeah, that one was particularly old, way more caked on basement dust on the tube surface than actual writing. It says made in somewhere on one side of the tube, and on the made, all you see is an M and a D, and then you see the word in, and then there's nothing from where it's made in. Probably made in the U.S. if it's 1959, I'm guessing. But anyway, here is another crossover tube. Yeah, so that's the all the tubes. I think there's 25 that I'm going to be including in the video, minus the few that didn't work quite right that got set aside, which I didn't put in the video. Yeah, those last four I think are the oldest tubes, because this sadly deceased gentleman that my father knew, I think there was an arc to his. And I think it was after he had, bachelor's and master's degree and all his, academic training, he got into building all these kits, the Heath kit, the Dynaco, the Harman Kardon hi-fi equipment. But as far as I can tell, these two crossover units were, being September 1959, were among the oldest kits that this guy built. And those are possibly the oldest of these 25 tubes, and they are way unique. This sort of gravelly, grainy breakup, but it's not like when when you drive the cheap Chinese tube really hard, the way it breaks up, it's like there's loose paper or confetti in your headphones or your speaker cabinet or whatever you're playing, the tubes through. But even though there's this really loose, grainy sound to the breakup of those last four tubes, there's something, it's still appealing to the ear. You just imagine some old cowboy with some really old amplifier and a Telecaster. And, this is through a used $20 microphone tube preamp with low voltage, pretend circuit. I have the feeling that those four tubes, you stick them in some vintagey tube amp with a real Telecaster with, real strings set up to do kind of chicken picking, and there would be some kind of vintagey magic going on with those. So I don't know if I'm going to sell the pair of crossovers with the original tubes, or if I'm going to figure out what those tubes are and sell them to some some Nashville guitar player that wants to try some vintage tubes in his tube amp. They're interesting, they're the ugliest, most caked on dirt of all those tubes. All four of them, I couldn't tell the four apart from any of the other tubes. Within those four tubes, I can't tell which is which. But each of those four tubes is just way different than all the other 12AX7s in a particular way. And they handle the heavy distortion, but it's not, I'm not thinking Marshall tone with that. If you put it in a mature amp, I'm thinking kind of Nashville old country Telecaster tone. Not that I'm into this kind of music at all, and I've never played a real tube amp, other than that baby Fender that the guy let me use from church when I was like 14. So, take all of my stuff with a grain of salt. I have the feeling that these are all real tubes, that if you put them in a big boy amplifier, they would do nice things for you. I don't know because I don't have a big boy amplifier and I'm not that kind of guitar player. I think I will sell some or all of them. I mean, obviously I'll keep enough to run my cheapo microphone preamps because I have projects I'd like to use with that, like record classical guitar and get a slight bit of crispiness on the loud notes, like the old Segovia recordings. That's sort of my thought process with that. But yeah, I'll be selling some of these tubes on eBay most likely. I'll probably post this video. I imagine a bunch of people will find this interesting, because of what all the tubes sound like next to each other in the same gizmo, especially when you're only looking at one tube in one gizmo. You're really comparing them face to face. But then the downside is it's a crappy gizmo compared to a real guitar amp with the high voltages and better circuit design. So I don't have much more to say other than this was a lot of fun. This was my first, other than getting those Pass 3s running like a week ago, these Dyna Pass 3 preamps. This is my first time actually playing music through tubes, other than, what I mentioned with the little Fender thing. And definitely my first experience trying different tubes. And one thing I can say, before I bought these preamps, which I recently got, the Art and the Behringer, we were just listening to the Behringer MIC100. I read some of these reviews, how real, or forums talking about them, real recording studio people think they're just garbage. And I could see why. They're kind of made for the home studio, low budget kind of situation, or backup or whatever. I feel like you could I think they are quite usable. I mean, if you set them so that they're not breaking up at all, they just do the basic job of being a preamp, making your, signal stronger so that you can run it through effects or DI box or whatever you need it for. And if you're careful with it and have a decent tube, or even the cheap Chinese tube that's in there, you can sort of gently dip into the soft distortion zone, and if you want that, the soft distortion on these is better than the 1928 Segovia recordings, where you feel that, like there's confetti in your speakers, but it's really just on the recording side of things, the tubes were distorting in an ugly way. There's old recordings that have that clipping in it, and this unit is better than that. So, I mean, and it does sound vintagey, the tube distortion, if you're not driving the tubes to a place where they sound totally ugly. I mean, ideally you're driving them to a place where no one even notices that it's clipping, but if you subtly analyze it with the spectrum analysis in Audacity, you'll see that there are some sort of tube harmonics kind of added in to the when it's sort of compressing a loud note or something. So I like these things. I am an amateur. I am on a budget. So there's that, but I think I'm smart enough to recognize what they're good for, and not just, I would never just use these for like a saturated distortion sound. If I wanted to get back into twiddling with Eddie Van Halen, I'd just get another digital modeling pedal. I traded my RP80 recently for a classical guitar, but I'd just get something like that again, or a newer type of thing. But if you use them either just for clean gain or for a slight bit of warmth, the whole Behringer Art or PreSonus little one tube mic preamps, I think, are fun. Changing the tube out is fun. they're useful. Of course, when you just buy something, you want to justify it. But anyway, I had a fun night. I don't know much else to say other than I'll probably post the video well in advance of selling the tubes. But I suppose people can leave comments if they know something that they want to tell me, and otherwise I'm just going to click stop here and post this on YouTube. Thanks for listening.